Thank you. Thank you to the organizer for this workshop, and also for this first ICRA, or ICRA, however you want to call it. It's really good to kind of share, like Dagmar and also like Lina did, some of the insights, some of the questions we're asking about the human neuromuscular system and control systems, and see potential threats and potential connection with the robotics community. So it's really great to present this work here. This is the outline of my talk. I'm going to give you a little bit, very quick overview regarding interactions in general, how we consider them, what kind of criteria we use to classify these different types of interactions that we have among humans. And then I'm going to zoom in into model cooperation, which is the topic of my talk. And in particular, we're looking at an object manipulation task that could be performed by manually or with another partner. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about the different approaches we took to kind of dissect the control problems and potential strategies that were extracted from this data. And then I'm going to finish with some open questions, mostly to see how, if any, what kind of connections we can bridge between human neuroscience and robotics, in particular human-robot interactions. So this is a very quick snapshot about the kind of work we do in the lab. We're very interested in upper limb, in particular in the human hand as a model system to understand complex motor control. And you could see that we use a number of, let's see if this works. Yeah. So we use a number of approaches, and really this variety of approaches is necessitated by the fact that the human hand is a very complex system from multiple perspectives. So we combine dynamic analysis, kinematics, and joint action, which I'm going to talk to you about today, virtual reality environments, similar to what Dagmar uses. And then we're also very interested in using neuromodulation, non-invasive brain stimulation as a system identification technique to try to tease out the control architecture for these particular tasks. And also try to apply some of the insights from human motor control to assistive devices. So let me tell you a little bit about human-human interactions. Some of you are probably familiar with the fact that in cognitive neuroscience, there has been and continues to be a great interest in human-human interaction, which again is a huge field, as you can imagine. Because with human-human interaction, you start to deal with a number of problems, a number of questions related, how do I relate to others? Is the fact that I can relate to others to reflect the fact that we share similar kind of plans, similar kind of systems, similar kind of expectations? So as you can imagine, and this is a beautiful book, I recommend if you're interested in the evolutionary basis of cooperation by Santello, why we cooperate, as the title says it all. We're looking at different species working together towards a common goal. But to zoom in a little more about separating motor from non-motor interaction, usually when there is no motor medium between two agents, then usually the literature refers to those kind of cooperation as social interactions. And there are many examples of social interaction you could think of, and there are multiple ways in which we can communicate intention, from, of course, the verbal communication to other, visual, verbal, or auditory cues, etc. And there is again plenty of literature that try to define the rules of engagement when a motor medium is not present. But regarding what I want to talk to you about today, which is really the key topic of this workshop, we're really talking about interactive motor behavior. So there is a motor activity which is shared by two or more agents. And I borrowed this diagram from this really great review. So also Lina brought this up in her talk by Jersey and colleagues. This is Etienne Bourdet's group. Was one of the first to kind of try to create a taxonomy, and through the taxonomy try to understand what kind of principle differentiate different kind of interactions. And so you look at two spaces here. One is about asking the question of what kind of task are we dealing with? And the other space relates to the behavior which is associated with that particular task. So if you look at the task space, you could ask the question whether the task necessitates two agents to work together or not. In other words, can you subdivide the task so that two agents can be independent or not? If there is this codependency for the attainment of the goal, then you are talking about interactive, but even then interactive behavior might be one where two agents actually compete with each other, so it could be an antagonistic kind of interaction, or it could be agonistic when now both agents actually care about the attainment of the common goal. And if you keep going down that taxonomy, that flowchart, Another key concept, which I'm sure it's prevalent in robotics as it is in social interaction literature, is this idea of role. So clearly, when you put a robot and a human agent, you can assign these roles, right? Either the human tries to follow the robot, or the robot tries to follow the human. And so you're already assigning a priori some kind of role asymmetry there. And in human-human interaction, a lot of the social interaction literature has actually focused on developing metrics to evaluate and quantify what makes a leader and what makes a follower. Usually, not always, this kind of distinction is based on who's leading the task, temporally or spatially. But as you will see from my talk, these definitions, lend themselves to different interpretations, and there are obviously more than one way to define leader and follower. But I do understand that in the robotics literature, this is a key topic. And when you couple human and robots, who's leading and who's following is not just semantics. It becomes a crucial piece of information and design principle, not just for the safety consideration, but also for the attainment of the goal that you wanted to attain. And so when you ask about the same versus different roles, you could think about a teacher and a student. And so if you go down that particular line, you're talking about cooperation or collaboration, depending on whether the roles are the same or not. And so having this in mind, the two particular topics that I'm going to be developing here is, again, this leader-follower, where there is this asymmetric roles, meaning that one agent does more, and we can define them more in many ways, but I'll get to that in a moment. Or there are symmetric roles. And then one of the question is, what are the neural and or model principle that allow this particular role emergence or role asymmetry to evolve during the task? And so, talking about our task, we developed an object manipulation task that has to be performed by two agents together. And this was work by Kevan Mojitahedi. This was part of his doctoral work, and also Yu Shifu was a postdoc at the time. And we started this work a few years ago, asking the question, as others before my talk did, that in fact we tend to know much more about motor control performed by a single agent than motor control and the principle of motor control by two agents working towards a common goal. So we thought of using a physical task to a physical object. And as we scanned the literature, we realized that this idea has also been brought up earlier, that when you have two agents working together, they perform better than either agent by himself or herself, might have been confounded by the fact that usually those kind of questions are asked by comparing an agent using one limb versus two agents where now you have two limbs cooperating. So one of the questions we wanted to ask is compare bimanual and joint actions, where now you have two limbs in both cases, only difference being that in the former you have one brain, in the latter you have two brains. But also we were kind of intrigued by this idea of limb dominance. So for those of you from the motor control, modern neuroscience literature, probably know about the work of Seinberg, was one of the first to posit that the two limbs might differ in terms of control, the dominant limb being better suited at dynamic tasks, and whereas the non-dominant limb will be better at impedance control and positional control. Now, this factor was never looked at, and so we thought that as we try to understand the rules of negotiations between two human agents, we should probably look also at this issue of limb dominance and see whether it matters or not. And so this is basically the two factors that we focused on. And so the manipulator is basically, we're going to compare again bimanual versus joint actions. And we're going to test the following hypothesis, that the performance of manipulation by dyads will be comparable to the one by single agents, based on the fact that you're still dealing with joints in both. And then this idea of dyadic performance being better in the dynamic versus the static phase, depending on whether you pair dominant or non-dominant limb, again stems from this idea proposed by Seinberg, whereby if you have two non-dominant limbs, that will be better than during the static phase, whereas the dominant limbs paired together will be better during the dynamic phase. So these were kind of the starting questions. So this is the object that we used. It's an object that has two handles on either side, and each handle is equipped with two 6-dimension force-torque sensors that allows us to compute the center pressure. These are grasped with the entire hand by both agents on each handle. And then the task is very simple, or at least seemingly simple, in the sense that they need to lift the object and maintain the orientation of the base as horizontal as possible, both in the dynamic and the static phase. And to help them with guiding that particular behavior, we also have a bubble level in the middle of the object. And so their task is really to do their best as they have this kind of corrective responses to try to keep the orientation as horizontal as possible. And so we compare single agents whereby you have each agent of the dyad perform the task by himself or herself. Or you have this kind of pairings of configuration and dominance whereby you could have a subject using the dominant and non-dominant limb and then you switch. Or the face-to-face configuration where now you have dominant and dominant and non-dominant and non-dominant. And then we track the performance. In this first study I'm going to tell you about, we just looked at the performance and see whether we could relate any of these factors to how the task is performed and see whether it matters, dominance, configuration, etc. So this is just a snapshot of the task. And so you see at the top the vertical position of the object, and at the bottom the error, which quantifies the deviation from the horizontal orientation of the desired object. So as you can imagine or predict, during the dynamic phase, because it's kind of it's a transient kind of position change, you see a larger error than during the static phase, and then we have the subject to do that again. So these transitions are acute by auditory signals that we give to the subject through headphones. And then the static phase again, and then they do another cycle, they replace the object again at this height, which is visually cued, and then they replace the object on the table. And then we'll look at the maximum absolute value, the mean absolute value of the error throughout either the static or the dynamic phase, as a very simple proxy of performance. So one of the things that we're interested in, and I will talk about that also in the other study, is whether this particular performance benefits from practice. And in this case, we just look at what happens within a very short block on the trials, and you see that there is a tendency for improvement, which means that this negotiation among two agents kind of evolves as they get to know each other, if you want to put it that way. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the dynamic phase is characterized by larger error than the static phase, because you have more time to make this correction and negotiations. But what's interesting is that if you look at this configuration, which is the dominant and non-dominant, the error tends to be smaller. So this is also an interesting paradigm because, as you could see, we're not only comparing dominant and non-dominance pairing, but also configurations. Here, they're set to side as you do the task manually, and here you do the task face-to-face. And if you're into cognitive neuroscience theories, and I would perceive the other, personal space, visual space, etc., it appears that this kind of configuration seems to be associated with a different way of performing motor action than this configuration. At that time, we didn't know because the work wasn't published yet. But then it's kind of nice to see that this work by Tiempo showed that this configuration seems to penalize performance more than this kind of configuration, or configuration face-to-face where the subject doesn't see each other because there is a person. That's a kind of interesting aspect of how we think about what dictates performance of a dyad. And it's not very intuitive, right? Because you would think mostly is depend on biomechanical factors, but even seeing somebody in front of you versus side by side seems to matter. So going back to this idea of effective practice and how people start to negotiate or learn to negotiate the action of the other, what we find is that, and I should point out that this is not a sequential order of blocks. These blocks were counterbalanced, but we string them together to see whether there's a cumulative effect of practice across the entire experimental session. As you can see, there's quite a bit of switch, quite a bit of noise in this performance, which probably is a reflection of the fact that you have carryover effect from the previous block. But again, there's an interesting pattern again emerging whereby face-to-face configuration seems to benefit the most from practicing. That's the only condition where subject learned to do this task, or at least there was an improvement in performance, whereas the other condition did not. And there is also a trend which is significant back at close, again, dominant and non-dominant during the dynamic phase. So this is a very kind of superficial, first attempt at trying to track how this configuration of indominance effect might play. But again, this dominance effect doesn't seem to be a major predictor of either performance or practice. So then the next question was to look at this idea that when you work with somebody else, your performance is better than when you perform the task by yourself. But remember, now we're comparing, unlike the group by Ganesh, with the Kawad and Bordet, which was very, very nice study, by the way. In this particular case, we're not comparing single limb versus joint action with another person, but we're comparing one subject using two limbs versus two subjects using one limb each. And when you do that, we use a very similar, actually identical format of representing the extent to which dyadic performance is better or worse than individual performance. So what we're plotting on the x-axis is the relative performance of one agent versus the other. So imagine you perform the task by yourself, manually, I measure the error, then I measure the other person in the type by himself or herself, I look at the error, and inevitably one person will be better than the other. So I could put them on the x-axis and I separate the better from the worst performer. But then ask the question, what happens when I couple that performer with another performer? And then the idea is that if you go towards this quadrant, it means that you do better, the worst subject does better when performing with another subject. The better partner, same, in the work by Kawada and Bourdain, this group will actually be here. In our case, the better performer in the solo performance does not get better when performing with another agent. So this is very, very different. You could break it down by conditions, but you could see at a glance, without spending too much time on each plot, that the pattern is very, very similar. And you could also quantify the extent to which, the frequency distribution of data points in each quadrant. You could see this kind of a mix. It's not a given that the worst performer always gets better with a partner. You could do this for the static phase, you could do this for the dynamic phase, but what's interesting is that the dynamic phase, it gets even worse. The worst partner doesn't benefit as much from performing with another agent as they do in the static phase. As you could see from these numbers, much smaller. So the summary for this particular study is that we couldn't find a clear effect of dominance. However, configuration seems to play a greater role than limb dominance pairing in this particular task. So one of the potential reasons that we commented in the paper of why you don't see this clear-cut limb dominance effect, as others have found in single arm movement, it could be that because you're pairing the subject with another, it could be that this impedance and the predictive control actually mix in complex ways, much more complex than in single arm control. And then I already hinted at why this visual configuration might matter. But also we found that interestingly in this particular test, when you compare bimanual with the joint action, the ceiling to how much dyadic performance, improved performance of one single agent is actually the performance of the better partner. So this is, again, it's just about performance analysis, but we wanted to go a little deeper, and so we analyze also forces and torques. Lina really mentioned the value of this haptic channels, right? So there's a force exchange, there's information that we constantly deliver, and whether it's small magnitude, as Lina showed earlier, or not, depending on the task conditions, the fact remains that as we physically interact, especially if the medium is rigid, there's quite a bit of information that we deliver, whether we're conscious of it or not. So the question was, okay, so we tried the performance, we saw that there is an effect of configuration, but what kind of information are the subject actually trying to exchange with each other? Because remember that the task is seemingly simple, but in fact, any small error that one subject makes has to be compensated or predicted by the other. And this flow of communication is continuous, especially during the static phase. And so it's not a trivial question to ask, how do you even manage to do this task at all, right? So to kind of try to get to this question, or to the answer, I should say, we looked at the total moments that each hand exerts on the handle. And this is what I'm plotting here. You can plot the moments evolution. You see that when there is a discrepancy, the error tends to be bigger, as you would expect. But then, as far as analysis, we do the cross-correlation of the moment rates. The moment rates, we define them as the propensity of one subject, if there's a difference between the moment rates between the two subjects, to perform more corrective actions. It's this kind of balancing act where you try to make more correction with the moment, the other one might kind of, try to do the same, and then we see how they line up temporally. But another thing that also relates to what Lina was saying before is that there's quite a lot of information in the force profiles that they exert in these handles. And so we did two things. One was to look at this internal force. And Van der Velde and others proposed this idea of haptic channel communication. And so the idea is that we look at internal force, a force that doesn't generate motion horizontally, and we see the extent to which this internal force might vary as a function of the conditions and hopefully related to other parameters of the execution. And the other concept, which is interrelated with the internal force idea, is that the load force sharing, which again is a key kind of a concept in human-robot interaction, and that is, how much do I want to share this load relative to you? Do I want to take 80% of the load and kind of lead the effort and be in charge of this for whatever reason? Or does it make more sense to negotiate with you a more even and equal share of the work, so to speak? And so we also looked at the load sharing, which is the sum of the load force of each handle, and see the extent to which they tend to be symmetrical or asymmetrical. So for the moment rate, not surprisingly, you find that during the bimanual task, the lags are much smaller than when you have two agents acting with each other. And again, this is kind of expectable, because I cannot predict what the other brain is trying to do as I negotiate this particular task. Whereas the idea is that one brain controlling two limbs, I will be better suited at generating these commands in a more or less synchronous fashion. For sure more than in the dyadic condition. And so this is true for dynamic and static phase. What's really interesting is that you see a dominance effect when you compare the dominant-dominant and the non-dominant-non-dominant. So it looks as if this challenge, if you want to call it that way, exemplified by the cross-correlation lags in moment rates, is exacerbated when you put two non-dominant hands coupled with each other. And it's smaller when you couple two dominant hands with each other. So it's kind of an interesting trend. But even more interesting trend is when you analyze internal force and how internal force relate to the load force sharing. So if you look at the internal force during the dynamic phase, I'm only plotting dynamic phase data here because the static phase is almost identical to this. During the dynamic phase, what you see is that in the bimanual task, when you're by yourself, the internal force is very, very small. Which again kind of follows this idea that internal force as a communication channel probably is not that necessary or functionally useful when you control the task by yourself. But when you switch to dyadic conditions, you see that for the dominant-non-dominant pairing and also for the dominant-dominant, they tend to be higher than bimanual. And for the non-dominant-non-dominant, almost zero, which is really puzzling. But if you relate that trend of the dyadic conditions with the trend in the load sharing, what you see is that the load sharing tends to be more and more and more asymmetrical as you go from the left to the right in the bottom panel, from the dyadic condition culminating with the non-dominant-non-dominant pairing. When you look at the two trends, then one possible interpretation of this association is that the internal force communication allows for a more even sharing of the load between the two agents, such that as more internal force is being communicated, you tend to have less of an asymmetry in how you share the load. This is just one of the interpretations, but it seems to be consistent with this data and other data that I'm not the time to show you. And it's definitely a testable hypothesis because you can imagine tasks where you could push the one agent to do more of the load sharing, etc., and see the extent to which the one is internal force or vice versa. So the summary is that clearly one thing that we learned as we studied this in a kind of simplistic fashion, but then we realized how complex this problem is, kind of echoing what Lina said before. There are clearly a number of factors. Some of them you can measure them directly using motor control techniques or biomechanics. And other factors are much, much more subtle. So the one I showed you are really biomechanically based. Look at this exchange of information. You can hypothesize the functional role of, say, exchanging internal forces, etc. But there are also, again, from cognitive neuroscience literature, other factors that are a little more subtle than just measuring this kind of parameters. And again, this has to do with visual perception of personal space, again, going back to this configuration effect, etc. So the work we're doing right now is really, and I mentioned the work by Takagi and colleagues, where they actually show that in fact this face-to-face versus set-to-set configuration, or face-to-face vision, face-to-face no vision configuration, seems to matter in how we do the task, even when you look at the exact same people. So I think there's some very interesting points there that it's worth keeping in mind as we think about the multitude of factors that affect how well we cooperate physically with others. And in particular, when we design robots, how do I want this robot to work with me? Do I want it in front of me? Do I relate to the robot? Does it relate to a human subject? Does configuration really matter? So these are all testable kind of hypotheses. And then this is the part I made earlier, and that is that there seems to be, but we need more data to back this up, there seems to be this kind of role of this haptic communication channel in terms of weighing how you decide to share the load with another partner. And again, this leader-follower kind of question is a big one and remains kind of the holy grail in a lot of this literature. So if I have a little bit of time, looks as if I do, a few minutes, I'm going to tell you about a study where I'm going to try to pin down the neural mechanisms that could be underlying these particular interactions. And I trimmed some of the results because I was afraid I was going to go over time, but I think I have enough time to tell you a little bit why we did this. And so, in the literature, this is true both for physical tasks and for neural mechanism tasks, or neural mechanism literature. The emphasis has been really in the social interaction, where there is no motor activity or a rigid medium that connect two agents in performing a task with a common goal. So there's a very interesting, very nice literature on, for example, people doing tapping tasks, where they could be undergoing EEG recording, fMRI recordings, clearance recording. And it is true to see that this partner coordination, not just in the motor output, but looking at partner coordination in brainwaves or in what particular areas get co-activated. Which again is really fascinating and goes back to this idea of who takes the lead, who follows. Can I predict who's the leader, who's the follower by just looking at brain activity patterns? Can I look at leader-follower relation by looking at synchrony of activity at specific frequencies in this EEG activity, etc. So it's really fascinating literature. What I'm showing below here is not an exhaustive list of work as I looked at this, but this is really what kind of set us and motivated us to ask the question, can we try to pinpoint the neural mechanisms in our physical task? So, and what we did then was to look at EEG, dual EEG, whereby both of the agents are scanned using the EEG. And we looked at, we did analysis, this is analysis which is ongoing, is work in progress. But we wanted to start our analysis by focusing on alpha oscillation frequency, 10 Hertz. And this also kind of overlapped with the 8 to 12, which is the new frequency, which is also considered to be important for the mirror system, sense of agency, etc. In the literature, the work by Konvalinsky and others have found that in fact, the alpha oscillation frequency, suppression of power at alpha frequency is a signature or leader-follower with these non-physical, non-motor tasks. And so we asked a very simple first question, would this alpha oscillation frequency modulation, the power modulation, be also associated with tasks, or now there's this kind of haptic channel of communication? And the hypothesis, again, totally based on previous work on EEG, was that alpha suppression would be greater in the leader than the follower. Now you may ask yourself, how do we define leader-follower in our task? And that has been a long kind of effort, and we're still looking at this. But we have the same object, and now we pair, or at least we contrast two kind of tasks, two kind of conditions. One whereby this role emergency, if any, emerges spontaneously. The other condition, we tell one of the subject to start the motion, whereas the other is going to follow. Very artificial, but nevertheless, the idea was to see whether the markers that we use here to define leader-follower may overlap with this leader-follower relation that can be imposed on the subjects. The good news is that if you look at the moment rate, and if you ask the question, are moment rates kind of share, in a more or less symmetrical fashion? Is there a tendency for one subject to make more moment-correct response than the other? And the answer is yes. We can argue whether this is a good measure to capture leader-follower relations, but it's a very simple one we started with. And both for the human-human and leader-follower relations, where this is artificial, this is emerging, this experiment too is characterized by randomizing the order of leadership followership. But what you see in both experiments, in both conditions of experiment one, you see this kind of asymmetrical sharing of moment-correct responses. And again, our operational definition of follower and leader is that the follower is the one that makes more model corrections, so the greatest model correction rates. And this is my last slide for as far as data is concerned. And what we did was to look at the spontaneous leader-follower relation defined by model rates, and the leader-follower group, whereby now we impose the leader role to one of the two. And what you can see is that there is this tendency for this central parietal areas to be particularly active, and this is the difference between the brain of the leader and the brain of the follower. And then this is the plot of the statistical results, where now you see these clusters of activity, which are very similar between the two cases. And when you see, this is analysis of power at the alpha frequency, because that's our central hypothesis. And what you see is that, in fact, similar to work on social interactions, the extent of alpha power suppression allows to dissociate the leader and follower, following our definition. And I think I need to rush now. I'm getting glares. So this is a summary. Again, the implication of this result is that social and model interaction might share this kind of neurocorrelate, this neuromarker, who is doing more work, who is paying more attention. Alpha power has also been associated with perceptual awareness, sense of agency, and other high-order kind of function. And so now the question is, can we look at different frequency bands? Can we learn more about different kind of analysis of this EEG analysis, EEG data beyond power analysis? So it's work in progress. I'd like to end with these open questions, with, which is the number 2 is really related to, how much do we care about extracting this information for human-robot interaction? And let me start from the number 2, since it's more relevant to this workshop and conference. Besides, what I presented, there's also work presented by the previous speakers. Clearly, there's a wealth of knowledge that we're extracting from this human studies, or human complex object studies. How much of this is actually is not just implementable, but what's really the key information we may have to apply to this human-robot interaction for goals that go beyond ensuring safety? And then again, what, if any, of these insights, I mentioned, could be used for these designers, right? Is configuration important? Is even the concept of leader-follower important? And if so, can you look at brain activity as subjects interact with robots and try to figure out to understand how this negotiation of role assignments occur? And then lastly, this role taking, again, is a big deal. I hope to have convinced you that assigning a role to an agent is way more complex than just measuring one variable. And so what we're doing now is try to weight the role of different factors to predict error and to predict role assignment. And these are my conclusions, and I'm going to leave it at that, and thank the sponsors and the lab, the kind of composition of the lab. Thank you.
We have time for a question as we have the next speaker set up. So, any questions? Yes.
Hi. Thanks for the talk. Did you notice any differences as time went on? Did people get better at coordinating with each other?
Yeah. So we did. So I removed some of the slides because I was afraid I would go over time. In fact, I did go over time. A few slides. There is a tendency, but that tendency is hardly related to this leader-follower relation. So this goes back to this bigger, almost abstract question of what makes a leader, what makes a follower. But as you're pointing out, I'm trying to connect two kind of things there. The stability of that role. So you're communicating some intent, and you could decide to stick to that role and the style of doing things, or you could switch depending on what kind of response you get from the other, like dancing. Right, so we see, when you do simple analysis like the error of the performance, you see that there is a tendency for people to get better, which implies that people are getting better attuned, so to speak, of the other reactions. But that also probably reflects some personality traits and some factors that are difficult to control for, other than trying to make sense after the fact.
Great. Thank you very much.